Hey guys, so today we're going to visit with Franklin D. Roosevelt, our 32nd president. In his inaugural address, Roosevelt promised prompt, decisive action. He conveyed some of his own unshakable self-confidence to millions of Americans listening on the radios throughout the land. This great nation will endure as it has endured and will will revive and prosper, he asserted, adding, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Which is actually true, if you think about it. Because if you're thinking about something and you're feeling that you're afraid to do it, if it's something that's not going to hurt you, the only thing that you're actually afraid of is the fear of doing that. Now, Roosevelt followed up on his promise of prompt action with the 100 days, the first phase of the New Deal, in which his administration presented Congress with a broad array of measures intended to achieve economy recovery, to provide relief to millions of poor and unemployed, and to reform aspects of the economy that Roosevelt believed had caused the collapse. Roosevelt was candid with admitting that the initial thrust of the New Deal was experimental. He would see what worked and what didn't, abandoning the latter and persisting with the former until the crisis was overcome. Meaning, if you've ever heard of the phrase throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks, pretty much the same thing. Like throwing ideas at the wall, seeing what worked and what didn't, and the items that stuck would work. And they would pursue what worked and abandoned what didn't. His first step was to order all banks closed until Congress, meeting in a special session on March 9th, could pass legislation allowing banks on sound condition to reopen. This bank holiday, as Roosevelt emphatically called the nation's entire banking system. The bank holiday, combined with emergency banking legislation and the first of Roosevelt's regular national radio broadcasts, later known as fireside chats. So, restored the public confidence that when banks would reopen, the much feared runs did not materialize. Now, there was two key recovery measures of the 100 days. The first was the Agricultural Adjustment Act and the National Industrial Recovery Act was the second. The AAA, or the Agricultural Adjustment Act, established the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, which was charged with increased prices of agricultural commodities and expanding the portions of national income going to farmers. Its strategy was to gain subsidies to producers of 7 basic commodities: wheat, corn, also known as maize, hogs, cotton, tobacco, rice, and milk. In return for reduced production, thereby reducing the surplus that kept the commodity prices low, the subsidies were to be generated from tax on the processing of commodities. When the Supreme Court invalidated the tax of 1936, Roosevelt shifted the focus of the AAA to soil conservation. But for the principle of paying farmers not to grow remain at the core of American agricultural policies for 6 decades. Although quite controversial when introduced, especially because it required the destruction of newly planted fields, and at the time when many Americans were going hungry, the AAA program gradually succeeded in raising farmers' incomes. However, it was not until 1941 that farm income reached an even inadequate level of 1929. The NEAR was a 2-part program. One part consisted of a $3.3 billion appropriation of public works to be spent at the Public Works Administration, or the PWA. Had this money been poured rapidly into the economy, it might have done too much, or much to stimulate recovery. Since Roosevelt wanted to be sure the program would not invite fraud and waste, however, the PWA moved slowly and deliberately and did not become an important factor until late in the New Deal. The other part of the NEAR was the National Recovery Administration, or the NRA, not to get confused with the National Rifle Association, whose task was to establish an administrator industry-wide code that prohibited unfair trade practices, set minimum wages and maximum hours, guaranteed workers and the rights to bargain collectively, and imposed controls on prices and production. The codes eventually became enormously complex and difficult to enforce. By 1935, the business community, which at first had welcomed the NRA, had become disillusioned with the program and blamed Roosevelt for its ineffectiveness. In May of that year, the Supreme Court invalidated the NRA, which by that time had few supporters in Congress or the administration. Another important recovery measure was the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA, a public corporation created in 1933 to build dams and hydroelectric power plants and to improve navigation and flood control in vast Tennessee basin. The TVA, which eventually proved cheap electricity to impoverished areas in 7 states along the river and its tributaries, regained a long-standing debate over the proper role of government in the development of the nation's natural resources. The constitutionality of the agency was challenged immediately after its establishment, but it was upheld by the Supreme Court in 1936. The 100 Days also included relief and reform measures for former referring to short-term payments of individuals to alleviate hardship. The latter to long-range programs aimed at eliminating economic abuses. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or the FERA, granted funds to state relief agencies and the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC, employed hundreds of thousands of young men in reforestation and flood control work. The Homeowners Reflecting Act provided mortgage relief for millions of unemployed Americans in danger of losing their homes. Reform measures included the Federal Securities Act, which provided government oversight of stock trading, later augmented by establishment of the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC, and the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act, which prohibited commercial banks from making risky investments and established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or the FDIC, which actually a lot of your banks still have that to this day. By the fall of 1934, the measures passed during the 100 Days had produced a limited degree of recovery. More importantly, they had regenerated hope that the country would surmount the crisis. Although the New Deal had alienated conservatives, including many businesses, most Americans supported Roosevelt's program. That support manifested itself in the congressional election of 1934, in which Democrats added to their already substantial majorities in both houses. Yet in 1935, Roosevelt knew he had to do more. Although the economy had begun to rise from its nadir during the winter of 1932 and 1933, it was still far below the level before the stock market crashed in 1929. Millions of Americans were still unemployed. Many had been jobless for several years, and the destitute were beginning to listen to damages who criticized the New Deal for not going far enough. Roosevelt foresaw the possibility that the 1936 presidential election, he could face a significant third-party challenge from the left. To meet this threat, Roosevelt asked Congress to pass additional New Deal legislation, sometimes called the Second New Deal, in 1935. The key measures of the Second New Deal were the Social Security Act, the Workers' Program, Progress Administration. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. And the Wages Act. The Social Security Act, for the first time, established an economic safety net for all Americans, providing unemployment and disability insurance and old age pensions. The WPA, headed by Roosevelt's close confidant Harry Hopkins, aimed to provide the unemployed with useful work that would help to maintain their skills and bolster their self-respect. Between 1935 and 1941, it employed it employed a monthly average of 2.1 million workers on a variety of projects, including the construction of roads, bridges, airports, and public buildings, natural resource conservations, and artistic and cultural programs such as painting public murals and writing local and regional histories. Now, I'm sure if you would go to your town, like somewhere in town, you would have like a local mural on one of the buildings or two of the buildings. I know in the town I live in, there's, I want to say 2 murals that like display the history of my town. Now the Wagner Act, officially the National Labor Relations Act, reestablished labor's right to bargain collectively, which had been eliminated when the Supreme Court had invalidated the NRA, not the National Rifle Association. And it created the National Labor Relations Board, or the NLRB, to adjudicate labor disputes. In addition to these landmark measures, Congress also passed a major tax revision, labeled by its opponents as "soak the rich" tax, that raised taxes for a person with large incomes and for large corporations. Reminds me of Robin Hood. Steal from the rich, give to the poor, or something along the lines. Anyway, Roosevelt ran for election in 1936 with the firm support of farmers, laborers, and the poor. He faced the equally firm opposition of conservatives, but the epithets hurled at him from the right merely helped to unify his following. The Republican nominee, Governor Alfred M. Landon of Kansas, a moderate who could do little to stem the Roosevelt tide. Landon received fewer than 17 million votes to Roosevelt's more than 27 million, and Roosevelt carried every state except Maine and Vermont. Declaring in his second inaugural address, "I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished." Roosevelt was determined to push forward and with further New Deal reforms, with large Democratic majorities in both Houses of Congress. There remained only one obstacle to his objectives: the Supreme Court. During Roosevelt's first term, the court, which consisted entirely of pre-Roosevelt appointees, had invalidated several new or key New Deal measures, and cases challenging the Social Security Act and the Wager Act were pending. To make the court more supportive of reform legislation, Roosevelt proposed a reorganization plan that would have allowed him to appoint new justice for every sitting justice, aged 70 years or older. Widely viewed as a court-packed scheme, even by Roosevelt's supporters, the reorganization bill provoked heated debate in Congress and eventually was voted down, which handed Roosevelt his first major legislative defeat. Meanwhile, the fight over court-packing seemed to alter the Supreme Court's attitude towards the New Deal, and both the Social Security Act and the Wager Act were upheld. By 1937, the economy had recovered substantially, and Roosevelt, seeing an opportunity to return to a balanced budget, drastically curtailed government spending. The result was a sharp recession, during which the economy began plummeting towards 1932 levels. Chastened by the recession, Roosevelt now began to pay more attention to advisors, who concealed difficult spending as the best way to counter the Depression. Late in 1937, he backed another massive government spending program, and by the middle of 1938, the crisis had passed. By 1938, the New Deal was drawing to close. Conservative Southern Democrats openly opposed its continuation, and Roosevelt's attempt to defeat several of them in 1938. In the 1938 Democratic primaries, not only provided unsuccessful, but also produced charges that the president was a dictator trying to conduct a purge. In the congressional elections that year, the Republicans gained 80 seats in the House and 7 in the Senate. Despite continued Democratic majorities in both houses, an alliance of Republicans and conservative Democrats now blocked any further reform legislation. By 1939, foreign policies was overshadowing Democratic policy. From the beginning of his presidency, Roosevelt had been deeply involved in foreign policy questions. Although he refused to support international currency stabilization at the London Economic Conference in 1933, by 1936 he had stabilized the dollar and concluded stabilization agreements with Great Britain and France. Roosevelt extended American recognition by the government of the Soviet Union, launched the Good Neighbor policy to improve U.S. relations with Latin America, and backed reciprocal agreements to lower trade barriers between U.S. and other countries. Congress, however, was dominated by isolationists who believed that American entry into World War I had been mistaken and who were determined to prevent the U.S. from being drawn into another European war. Beginning with the Neutrality Act of 1935, Congress passed a series of laws designed to minimize American involvement with belligerent nations. Roosevelt accepted the neutrality laws, but at the same time warned Americans of danger if remaining isolated from the world, increasingly menaced by the dictatorial regime in Germany, Italy, and Japan. Speaking in Chicago in October of 1937, he proposed that peace-loving nations make consecrated efforts to quarantine aggressors. Although he seemed to mean nothing more drastic than breaking off diplomatic relations, the proposal created such alarm throughout the country that he quickly backed away from even this modest level of international involvement. Then in December, the Japanese sank an American gunboat, the USS Panny, on the Yangtze River in China. Most Americans feared that the attack would lead to war, and they were pleased when Roosevelt accepted Japan's apologies. When World War II broke out in Europe in September of 1939, Roosevelt called Congress into special session to revise the Neutrality Act to permit belligerents like Britain and France to buy American arms on cash and carry basis. Over the objections of isolationists, the cash and carry policy was enacted when France fell to the Germans in the spring and early summer of 1940, and Britain was left alone to face the Nazi war machine. Roosevelt convinced Congress to intensify defense preparation and support Britain with all aid support of war. In the fall of that year, Roosevelt sent 50 older destroyers to Britain, which feared an imminent German invasion, in exchange for 8 naval bases. The swap of ships for bases took place during the 1940 presidential election campaign. Earlier in the year, the Democrats had nominated Roosevelt for a third term, even though his election would break the 2-term tradition honored since the president of George Washington. The Republican nominee, Wendell L. Willkie, represented a departure from the isolationist dominated Republican Party, and the two candidates agreed on most foreign policy issues, including increased military aid to Britain. On Election Day, Roosevelt defeated Willkie soundly by 27 million to 22 million popular votes. Though the margin of victory was less than it had been in 1932 and 1936, Roosevelt's supporters had reduced the numbers of factors, including the court packing scheme, the attempted purge of progressive Democrats in 1938, the breaking of the two-term tradition, and fears that he would lead the nation into war. By Inauguration Day in 1941, Britain was running out of cash and finding it increasingly difficult, owing to German submarine attacks, to carry American arms across the Atlantic. In March of 1941, after a bitter debate in Congress, Roosevelt obtained passage of the Lend-Lease Act, which enabled the U.S. to accept non-cash payments for military and other aid to Britain and its allies. Later that year, he authorized the U.S. Navy to provide protection for Lend-Lease shipments. And the fall, he instructed the Navy to shoot on sight at German submarines. All these actions moved the U.S. closer to actual belligerency with Germany. In August of 1941, on a battleship off Newfoundland, Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill issued a joint statement. The Atlantic Charter, on which they pledged their countries to the goal of achieving the final destruction of the Nazi tyranny. Reminiscence of the four freedoms that Roosevelt outlawed in his annual message to Congress in January of 1941. The statement declared territorial agonism and affirmed a commitment to national self-determination, freedom of the seas, freedom from want and fear, greater economic opportunities, and disarmament of all aggressor nations. Yet, it was in the Pacific rather than the Atlantic that war came to the United States. When Japan joined the Axis powers of Germany and Italy, Roosevelt began to restrict exports to Japan of supplies essential to making war. Throughout 1941, Japan negotiated with the United States, seeking restoration of trade in those supplies, particularly petroleum products. When the negotiations failed to produce agreement, Japanese military leaders began to plan an attack on the United States. According to one school of thought, this was exactly what Roosevelt wanted, for by backing Japan into a corner and forcing it to make war on the United States, the president could then enter the European war in defense of Britain. The so-called backdoor to war theory. This controversial hypothesis continues to be debated today. By the end of November, Roosevelt knew that the attack was imminent. The United States had broken the Japanese code, but was uncertain where it would take place. To his great surprise, Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on December 7th, 1941. Now, I think I actually did something about Pearl Harbor Day. If not, if I didn't, I will actually do one on Pearl Harbor Day. And I think that's actually known as D-Day. Now this destroying or damaging nearly the entire U.S. Pacific Fleet and hundreds of airplanes, and killing about 2,500 military personnel and civilians. On December 8th, at Roosevelt's request, Congress declared war on Japan. On December 11th, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. At the press conference in December of 1943, Roosevelt asserted that Dr. New Deal had been replaced by Dr. Win the War. The many New Deal agencies assigned to provide employment during the Great Depression rapidly disappeared as war mobilization created more jobs than there were people to fill them. Full economic recovery, which had resisted Roosevelt's efforts throughout the 1930s, suddenly came about as the consequence of massive government spending on war production in the early 1940s. From the start of American involvement in the World War II, Roosevelt took the lead, establishing great alliances among all countries fighting the Axis powers. He met with Churchill in a number of wartime conferences at which differences were settled amicably. One early difference centered upon the question of invasion of France. Churchill wanted to postpone such an invasion until Nazi forces had been weakened, and this prevailed until the Great Normandy invasion was finally launched on D-Day on June 6th of 1944. Now, I actually did go over about D-Day. Meanwhile, American and British forces invaded North Africa in November of 1942, Sicily in July of 1943, and Italy in September of 1943. Relations between the Soviet Union and posed a difficult problem for Roosevelt. Throughout the war, the Soviet Union accepted large quantities of Lend-Lease supplies, but seldom divulged its military plans or acted in coordination with its Western allies. Roosevelt believed that the maintenance of peace after war depended on friendly relations with the Soviet Union, hoped to win the confidence of Joseph Stalin. Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill seemed to get along well when they met at Tehran in November of 1943. By the time the Big Three met again at the Yalta Conference in Kremen, USSR, in February of 1945, the war in Europe was almost over. At Yalta, Roosevelt secured Stalin's commitment to enter the war against Japan soon after Germany's surrender and established democratic governments in the nations of Eastern Europe occupied by Soviet troops. Stalin accepted his pledge concerning Japan, but proceeded to impose Soviet satellite governments throughout Eastern Europe. Roosevelt had been suffering from advanced arteriolysis for more than a year before the Yalta Conference. His political appointments had tried to make much of his obvious declining health during the campaign of 1944, when he ran for a fourth term against Governor Thomas E. Dewey of New York. But Roosevelt's campaign achieved actively and won the election by a popular vote of 25 million to 22 million, an electoral college vote of 232 to 99. By the time he returned from Yalta, however, he was so weak for the first time in his presidency, he spoke to Congress while sitting down. Early in April of 1945, he traveled to his cottage at Warm Springs, Georgia, the Little White House, to rest. On the afternoon of April 12th, while sitting on the porch, he suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage and died a few hours later. With him at his death were two cousins, Laura Delano and Margaret Suckley, and Lucy Mercer Rutherford, by then a widow, with whom he had renewed his relationship a few years before. During his lifetime, Franklin D. Roosevelt was simultaneously one of the most loved and most hated men in American history. His supporters hailed him as a savior of his nation during the Great Depression and the defender of democracy during World War II. Opponents criticized him for undermining American free market capitalism, for unconstitutionally expanding the powers of the federal government, and for transforming the nation into a welfare state. It is generally accepted by all, however, that he was a brilliant politician, able to create a massive coalition of supporters that sustained the Democratic Party for decades after his death. There is also little argument that he was a talented administrator, able to retain leaders of diverse views within the executive branch. At his death, most Americans were plunged into profound grief, testimony to the strong emotional attachment they felt for the man who had led them through two of the darkest periods in the nation's history. Although much of that emotion is disbanded over the years, Roosevelt, standing as one of the few truly great American presidents, seemed secure. And with that, I will see you all in the next one.